Mars in the second house, value and security. Welcome to Mars in the second house in synastry. In this overlay, we explore what happens when one person's Mars falls into another person's second house, the house of material resources, personal values, earned income, physical possessions, and the foundational sense of security that comes from knowing what one has and what one is worth. This is a less immediately obvious overlay than Mars in the first. It does not announce itself in the body at first meeting or generate the kind of instant physical charge that the angular houses tend to produce. Its effects accumulate over time in the practical and material fabric of the relationship, in conversations about money, in attitudes towards spending and saving, in the quiet but persistent question of whose values are shaping the shared life, and whose are being subordinated to accommodate someone else's. Mars here is not subtle in its ultimate impact, but it takes longer to reveal itself, and by the time it does, its patterns are often already well established. The second house governs everything that gives a person material and psychological grounding. This includes money and possessions in the literal sense, but extends further into the domain of self-worth, the internal assessment of one's own value, the confidence that one deserves what one has, and the capacity to hold one's ground when that sense of worth is challenged. It is the house of what we have built through our own effort, what we refuse to surrender, and what we depend upon to feel safe in the world. In traditional astrology, the second house is associated with livelihood and sustenance, the resources that keep the body alive and the self intact. It is a succedent house, which means it builds on what the first house establishes. Where the first house is the self, the second house is what that self possesses and what it believes itself to be worth. Mars, as has been established, is a malefic, a planet whose energy is inherently activating, sharpening, and potentially cutting. In the second house, that energy is directed at the terrain of material security and personal value. This can produce genuine ambition and productive drive around shared resources. It can also produce conflict, destabilization, and in its more difficult expressions, a dynamic in which the house person's financial security or sense of self-worth is persistently undermined by the Mars person's forceful presence in that domain. The second house is not a house that responds well to being invaded. It is a house that requires stability to function, and Mars is not a planet that naturally provides stability. It provides motion, friction, and heat. From the Mars person's perspective, the house person's material world is immediately noticeable and provocative in some sense, not necessarily negatively, but with a quality of engagement that goes beyond passive observation. The Mars person may feel energized by the house person's resources, drawn to their material competence, or stimulated by the question of what the two of them might build or accumulate together. There is often a genuine desire here to contribute to the house person's material life, to help them earn more, build more, establish greater security. The Mars person may function as a catalyst for the house person's ambition, pushing them toward financial goals they might not have pursued with the same urgency on their own. The Mars person may also, however, have strong and not always negotiable opinions about how the house person's resources should be managed. They may feel entitled to weigh in on financial decisions that are not strictly theirs to make, to push the house person toward expenditures or investments that reflect the Mars person's own values rather than the house person's considered judgment. This is not always malicious. Mars acts from instinct and appetite more than from calculation, but the effect on the house person can be experienced as a persistent encroachment on their domain of material self-determination. From the house person's perspective, the Mars person's energy lands in the most private and foundational layer of material life. This can be experienced as vitalizing, as a genuine injection of drive and ambition into an area of life where the house person may have been stagnant, overly cautious, or insufficiently confident in their own capacity to generate and hold resources. The Mars person can genuinely motivate the house person to take financial risks they would otherwise avoid, to assert their worth more forcefully in professional contexts, or to develop a more active and engaged relationship with their own material security. But the house person may equally find, over time, that the Mars person's presence in this domain feels less like activation and more like intrusion. The second house is where a person keeps their most fundamental sense of security, their money, yes, but also their values, their possessions, the private architecture of what they have decided matters to them. When Mars arrives here in another person's chart, it brings an energy that is inherently challenging to that architecture. The house person may find that their financial choices are consistently second-guessed, that their values are treated as negotiable when the Mars person's values conflict with them, or that what they have built with their own effort is regarded by the Mars person as a resource to be directed rather than a private domain to be respected. At its most constructive, this overlay produces a genuine and productive partnership around the building of material security. The Mars person's drive combines with the house person's sense of what is truly worth having to create a shared ambition that is both energized and grounded. The house person provides the values and the direction. The Mars person provides the fuel and the momentum. When this works well, the two people can build something together that neither would have built alone, not because they agree on everything, but because the productive friction between Mars's drive and the second house's focus on what genuinely matters produces results that are more substantial than either person's individual effort. This overlay can also produce a quality of financial generosity from the Mars person toward the house person, a willingness to spend energy and resources in the house person's material domain with genuine enthusiasm. Mars here wants to provide, wants to build, wants to demonstrate its value through material action. When that impulse is welcomed and well-directed, it can be a genuinely useful force in the house person's material life. The shadow dimension of this overlay requires honest attention, because Mars in the second house carries real potential for financial conflict, material control, and the erosion of the house person's sense of economic self-determination. The second house is the domain of personal resources, what one has earned, saved, and chosen to value. Mars does not naturally respect existing boundaries in whatever house it occupies. It pushes, it tests, it applies force to whatever it encounters. In the second house, that force is applied to the most material and foundational layer of personal security. At the level of ordinary conflict, this overlay frequently produces persistent disagreements about money, about how it is spent, how it is saved, whose financial priorities take precedence, and what the shared resources of the relationship are actually for. The Mars person and the house person are likely to have genuinely different instincts about material security, and Mars's instinct is always to push its own position rather than to defer. These disagreements may be manageable, even productive, when both people have the capacity to negotiate. But Mars does not always negotiate. It often simply escalates until the other person yields, and the second house person, whose fundamental need is for stability and security in this domain, may find that yielding becomes a pattern with consequences that extend well beyond individual financial decisions. At the more serious end of this spectrum, Mars in the second house is associated with financial control and the weaponization of material resources as a means of dominance within the relationship. The Mars person may come to exert authority over the house person's earnings, spending, or access to shared resources in ways that compromise the house person's independence and reinforce a dependency that serves the Mars person's appetite for control rather than the house person's genuine well-being. This is one of the recognizable patterns of economic abuse, and while this overlay does not produce that outcome inevitably, or even commonly, it belongs to the honest account of what Mars's malefic nature can generate when it operates in the domain of another person's material security without sufficient restraint or awareness. The distinction between the vitalizing and the damaging expressions of this overlay again comes down to the question of whose agency is being served. Mars's energy in the second house is most constructive when it amplifies the house person's own financial confidence and material ambition, when it pushes them toward more, rather than redirecting what is already theirs. It becomes destructive when the Mars person's drive is oriented not toward building the house person's resources, but toward controlling them. At its highest expression, Mars in the second house creates a relationship in which both people are genuinely motivated to build something of lasting material value together, in which the Mars person's energy is a genuine asset to the house person's material life, and the house person's clear sense of value gives the Mars person's drive a worthy and grounded direction. There is real productivity possible here, real ambition, real satisfaction in the concrete evidence of what two people have made together. When balanced, Mars in the second house creates financial drive, productive ambition, material activation, and a relationship in which resources are built with genuine energy and shared purpose. When imbalanced, it can produce persistent financial conflict, the erosion of material autonomy, and, at its most destructive, the use of economic control as a tool of dominance over the very person whose security the Mars person first claimed to want to build. What this overlay ultimately asks of both people is a clear-eyed answer to a deceptively simple question. Is the energy being brought into the domain of material security here genuinely in service of what the house person has decided they value? Or is it quietly, persistently, reshaping that domain into something that serves someone else's appetite instead?
This was Mars in the second house in Synastry overlays. Thank you for listening. Next, Mars in the third house.